Hour 13 is a very special moment for me because now we're going into the part of literature which we can describe as prose. And I'm going to be concentrating in Hour 13 on Herodotus. And then in Hour 14, I'll concentrate on Philostratus. Now, it's interesting that Herodotus can be dated to the 5th century BCE, but Philostratus is to be dated to the early 3rd century CE. So that's a lot of years between one prose source and another. And it just shows you that as we now move to a new kind of evidence about and from ancient Greek song culture, we're going to get different kinds of information about the main topic of our project, which is the idea of the ancient Greek hero. Hour 13 is an exercise in reading things in different ways. And even the key word, krinein, is all about trying to make decisions about whether we read things one way or another way. And sometimes it's not a matter of a right way and a wrong way, but simply a better way and a less good way, or sometimes it's a matter of having one kind of an ending to a story versus another kind of ending to the story. And I like the fact that krinein, this key word, gives us such English borrowings as crisis, critical. And I even think that the derivative critical is more interesting because critical can refer to how you or I might be critical of this or that answer to a question. But it can also mean critical in the sense of this is a moment when it's life and death, or this is the moment when some decision has to happen. The critical moment. Of all critical moments, one of my favorites when it comes to ancient Greek heroes is from a dialogue between the person who is considered the most wealthy, the most powerful, the most prestigious person in the whole world, and he's the king, and then the wisest person in the whole world, and he's the Athenian lawmaker Solon. The king's name is Croesus, and Croesus wants to get an answer that will please him about who is the most fortunate of all humans. And of course, the answer that Croesus expects, because he's living only in a material world, is that the criteria, and that's another word that derives from krinein, the criteria would involve wealth, power, prestige, to give you the triad that Max Weber loves to work with. But the criteria of Solon, the wise man, who's answering this question, who is the most Olbios of all, have to do with a deeper meaning of the word Olbios. Not Olbios in the sense of fortunate, but Olbios in the sense of blessed, the way a hero is blessed and the way the worshippers of a hero become blessed by making either physical or mental contact with the hero, who is now a cult hero. And in the two stories I have primarily in mind, these symmetrical stories that are mediated by Solon's telling the story, but ultimately the story is of course told by Herodotus. In these two stories, which are text A and text D, we have two models of cult heroes that, according to Solon, are the ideals for what it is to be truly blessed. And the first example of somebody who is the most Olbios, when you read my reportage about the text that we're reading closely for this hour, is an Athenian called Tellos. And it turns out that this name is already an indication, you could even call it a sema, of the fact that heroes represent, stand for, the idea of a perfect initiation. The name of Tellos, T-E-L-L-O-S, actually evokes the meaning of T-E-L-O-S, telos, which is the word for a perfect initiation, a perfect ritual experience. But I'm not going to concentrate on Tellos in my quick sketch and go straight to the second example, which is a pair of twins called Kleobis and Biton. in the discourse between Croesus, the tyrant of the Lydians, and Solon, the wise man of the Athenians. When it comes to who is the most Olbios of all humans, if it isn't Tellos the Athenian, well then surely it is a pair of twins called Kleobis and Biton, who are from the city of Argos. And the storytelling of Herodotus, who is reporting all of this, is even more detailed when it comes to the second example. You might say this is the second prize example, since the first prize it goes to the Athenian. The second prize goes to this pair of twins. But let me talk a little bit about this pair of twins. It's clearly they are cult heroes as far as the people of Argos are concerned. And the story of how they became cult heroes and how they are the sons of none other than the priestess of Hera herself, who represents both the priestess and the goddess, everything that has to do with hora, with being on time. And here are these two boys who take the place of sacrificial oxen and pull the sacrificial carriage on which the priestess of Hera is riding, all the way from the city center of Argos to a special sacred place called Heraion, or the precinct of Hera, the sacred space of Hera, where after all their exertion, which seems almost superhuman, they both fall into a deep sleep, and in the mystical language, as reported by Herodotus, they never get up again. By that he means they never get up again in this life, and the mystical hint here is that they'll have a resurrection, and then when they wake up, there'll be another life, which will be the life of cult heroes. I'm particularly fascinated with how Herodotus says at the end of the narrative, at the end of this story, that actually the people of Argos, after Kleobis and Biton became cult heroes, commissioned statues of them, and that these statues were then dedicated at Delphi, the most holy place of Apollo on the ancient Greek-speaking mainland. Towards the end of the 19th century, French excavators actually discovered the statues that Herodotus is talking about, right there at Delphi. And today, if you go to the museum of the site at Delphi, you will actually see statues of these two cult heroes, Kleobis and Biton. And of course, what Herodotus says about how these statues were commissioned to be made in honor of Kleobis and Biton doesn't have to be exactly accurate. Art historians tell us that these two statues may have been recycled from earlier uses. Doesn't matter. In terms of the story of Kleobis and Biton, these statues are connected directly to the two figures that we see in this story, in this myth about the cult heroes Kleobis and Biton. And when I say myth, I'm talking in this case about a charter myth. I use the term charter myth to indicate that a myth has special significance to a particular set of people, in this case, to the people of Argos. So when we go to Delphi today, and we go to the museum at Delphi, we have the chance, and our study group actually saw this, we have a chance to see these two boys, or should I say the statues of these two boys, staring you in the face as you come down the hall, and there they are, they have the room all to themselves. And in this eternal pose of bliss, being Olbios, they're looking back at you. It's truly a mystical moment, even for us, when we visit the museum. And then I had the good chance of visiting the sacred place where these two boys, according to the myth, died peacefully after their superhuman exertion, after taking the place of the sacrificial oxen. And I must say, I felt so lucky. I don't dare say I was Olbios, but as you see from the film that we took of this almost sacred moment when our Harvard study group was visiting this sacred site, the asphodels were in bloom. This is a very special mystical flower that is associated with Achilles when he reaches the other life, the life after death. And there's a hint of this other life in Odyssey 11, when Achilles, after his interview with Odysseus, goes off to the meadow of asphodel. And we had our own meadow of asphodel moment, these beautiful long-stalked white flowers. And imagine a meadow that is just suffused with asphodel as far as the eye can see. And then you look into the distance and you see the city center of Argos, from where 45 stadium lengths the two boys pulled the sacred carriage of the goddess Hera, with the priestess riding on the carriage, all the way from that city center to this sacred place of Hera. And there we are looking at the mead of asphodel with its beautiful implications of a life after death, as promised by the beauty of this flower. So this will be really one of the high points of our reading experience when we go through hour 13. Another high point is the moment when the goddess of vegetation, Demeter, and I'm talking about text C of hour 13, when the goddess Demeter predicts the hero cult of a young child called Demophon, Demophon. And the prediction of this hero cult has a great deal to do with the very concept of what it is to be on time, to be timely. And then we'll see very interestingly that the rituals involved in this hero cult are seasonally recurring. That is going to be so important for the remainder of our project, that on the level of ritual, the worship of heroes is seasonally recurrent. Even though the hero was unseasonal in his or her life, he becomes the exponent of seasonality in death as a cult hero. And then in the remainder of the text that I explore in hour 13, we look at various uses of the word krinein, the word that tells us a great deal about how to make decisions in how to read one way or another way. And besides text E, there are similar references to the critical faculty of deciding between what is right and wrong in text F, and then even in text G. And when we are dealing with text F and G, and for that matter H, I'm switching back to poetry. In the hours to come, it'll be easier for me to switch back and forth from prose to poetry and then from poetry back to prose. But most of our fundamental information will come from prose. In the case of this hour, we will start understanding, I think, even better what the poetry ascribed to Hesiod is all about, and the preoccupation of that poetry with what is morally right and what is morally wrong. We started considering that in hour 12, but here at hour 13, we can get a better handle on this very important role of Hesiodic poetry. And similarly, we can even get a better handle on how to interpret that all-important scene that is commonly known as the Shield of Achilles in Iliad 18. And I'm thinking of the point where the camera of the narration zooms in on a litigation between an anonymous plaintiff and an anonymous defendant. As we're looking at that picture of this proto-litigation, we start realizing that there too, it's a question of deciding. It's a critical point, the critical moment, deciding what is right, what is wrong, what is the value of a human life. And last but not least, in text K, I give you a preview of how this kind of poetry, the kind of poetry that is represented by Hesiod and Homer, extends well into the historical period. And the particular example I use here in text K is a situation where the point of reference is a historical city and what happens to questions of right and wrong in that historical city. And the same goes for text L, which is the same problem, but viewed through a different lens.